Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our first two presentations that got the meeting off to a very, very successful start. I just want to say that I'm extremely excited about this session that is about to begin. This is the real progress session, reports of the work and progress and deliverables to date of our three working groups. The working groups have been, I will say, a major effector arm of MCBK. We formed them very soon after the 2018 meeting, which brought CBK into existence, MCBK into existence, and we've been really, really privileged to have superb working group chairs and superb participation at the working group sessions, which took place both at the meetings that we have had annually and on numerous occasions in synchronous sessions between the meetings. And of course, there has been lots of work by the work group participants between those synchronous sessions. And I think you're going to hear about the results of this work, the fruits of this labor in the session that's about to begin and that Rachel will be moderating. Let me introduce how this session is going to work. We are going to have about a 15-minute presentation by each working group, followed by 5 minutes of question and answer specific to the presentation and the content of that working group. Then, after all three of the working groups have presented and entertained questions, we will have a general question and answer session. So that will be the plan. And as I said, the focus here will be not only what the working groups have done, but what they have produced as a result of what they have done as a major contribution, we believe, of MCBK to achieving its goals and objectives. So the three working groups and the co-chairs who will be the presenters will begin with the Sustainability and Inclusion group, and the co-chairs of that group are Jerry Perry and Terry Wheeler. We will continue then with the I need my glasses to read my own notes. Excuse me. The Standards and Technical Infrastructure Group. Three co-chairs will present, Bob Greenis, Bruce Bray, and Jamie McCusker. And the third group will be the Policy and Coordination to ensure quality and trust. And the co-chairs who will be presenting from that work group are Jody Platt and Blackford Middleton. So with this, let me turn this session over to Rachel, who will be our moderator.
Terrific. And let's go ahead and get started with our first presentation, which will be the Sustainability Working Group. There. Hi, Terry and Jerry.
Hey, how are you?
Doing okay.
Awesome.
Technology is working.
Terrific. So I'm Jerry Perry, and I'm the Associate Dean for the University of Arizona Libraries. And I'm delighted to be co-presenting today with my terrific colleague, Terry Wheeler. And we'll be talking about the work that we've been doing to mobilize computable biomedical knowledge. And today, for our segment of this session, Terry is going to be the first to speak, and then I'll be talking about some future plans and some ideas that we have. I'll proceed. Terry.
Hi there. I'm Terry Wheeler. I'm the director of the Samuel J. Wood Library at Weill Cornell Medicine, and I want to tell you what we've been up to for this past year. So one of the things that we've been really focusing on is advocacy through affiliations. And so we've been able to develop a process for acknowledging affiliations. And for example, in this past year, we developed an affiliation with the American Association of Health Sciences Libraries, and we've develop some language around that, and in the form of a memorandum of understanding, and how to share between different groups when the groups are establishing a formal collaboration with MCBK. One of the purposes of doing that is, of course, sustainability, and through our scholarship, which is another avenue that we've really and tried to enlarge sustainability, enlarge the group of interest through MCBK. We are in the process of developing a web-based guide for informational resources on health equity in CBK, and that will be made available after we complete it through all the libraries, and nationally and internationally, and in addition to any of our MCBK partners. We are in the process of developing a thought piece, which is an article to highlight health equity in CBK. And so one of the smaller work group sessions tomorrow will be continuing that work. And then we also foresee other publications that might arise from this work. And then what are we going to be doing tomorrow? We have two very important work group sessions. One is going to develop super short video clips that are going to take an MCBK expert or a thought leader and describe in a 1 or 2 minute clip what MCBK is and how it is important. And we're hoping that these video clips might additionally gain partners and raise interest in MCBK so that this community can continue to grow. The second work group is going to be developing an expert panel that will address MCBK issues. And you see the areas that we're going to be addressing there on your screen: health equity, bias, and other issues that are important to us because of our inclusion piece of our work group's work. And this we're calling it a mid-year panel. So we're going to offer it sometime in between this conference and next year's conference. And so that work continues on throughout the year and isn't just during our annual conferences. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jerry, who's going to talk about what we're going to be doing in the future.
Thanks so much, Terry. Where so much of this morning's sessions, the keynotes that we heard, and I have to say, especially what we heard from Deborah McGinnis, resonates so clearly and so loudly with the work of the Sustainability Inclusion team. And we are nothing if not an ambitious work group with lots of ideas that we have been considering. So we wanted to share a little bit about what some of our future ideas were to enhance, extend, and make those connections with the excitement that we feel with this audience, and to bring you into our processes. So we're going to continue our work around advocacy through affiliations. As Chuck mentioned earlier today, and Rachel, there's going to be conversation about how this MCBK is organized. And after we have a structure that's more formally in place, we're hoping to continue our research and outreach engagement with other entities, since we know that collaboration is really critical, as we understand from the presentations earlier today around the use cases. We also want to persist in our work around advocacy through scholarship. As Terry mentioned, we've got our thought piece. We want to see that through to publication, and we've got lots of other ideas for publications and that we would like to pursue. And when I say publication, we're looking at many formats and many styles and ways to present information. For example, the video clips. We're also looking at other kinds of ways that we can get this information out. We think that that's really very, very important. We also want to focus a little bit more on advocacy through education. And some of the ideas that we have under consideration are building a kind of portfolio of usable reusable digital resources that will support the CBK advocacy and education work that we're trying to do. We're all about reusability and accessibility, findability. So we would like to have this information available as an asset for our entire community as we might see opportunity. We also want to develop some examples or some use cases of some real life applications of the FAIR principles, as well as the CARE principles in various sustainability and inclusion contexts. Let me say something very quickly around the CARE principles. I'm not sure how many people know about them, but this is really looking at principles around data use from agency perspective and the rights of individuals and communities. On our campus, there's been a lot of focus here around Indigenous Americans and Native Americans and their data. And so that's really where this notion is grounded, but it's extensible to other communities where agency around their data perhaps hasn't always been emphasized, and a need to really bring that voice. And we heard that, I think, in the two presentations earlier today around engagement with patients, for instance, and the health equity lens. And then another thing we want to focus on is developing a research online course or a relevant course, I should say, in the instance of inclusive teaching and learning health systems. We want to draw our work and connect it to the learning health systems component. So we see that that's really critical around sustainability. Then the last thing that I'll say is we're also looking at advocacy through research. And this is for us an aspirational goal, since our particular team hasn't really focused so much on the research enterprise per se. But we are thinking about the utility of perhaps developing a sustainability and inclusion roadmap for research. What is the kind of research that we think needs to be done to enhance sustainability and inclusion in the CBK context? And how can we model that information? We also want to bring and remind folks of the value principle that we bring to all of this, since ours is values-based work. And then we're also interested in taking a design thinking or user experience approach and other strategies around how we might develop that research agenda. Once again, circling back to the notion of agency and how we bring agency forward. So that's it for what I think we wanted to present around both the work we've accomplished so far and then the ideas that we have moving us, we feel, into a sustainable future. So with that, I think I'll advance to see if there might be any questions that either Terry or I could address.
Terrific. Thank you, Jerry and Terry, for such a great summary, and the work of this group is truly inspiring. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I do want to remind folks to please type them, particularly if you have some clarifying questions on the scope of the group or some of the activities that were just discussed. Go ahead and put those in the Q&A. For the other work groups, we'll have the same procedure. So the work group chairs will give a summary. We'll ask some clarifying or simple kinds of questions, and then we'll move into the discussion portion. And I actually have a number of meaty questions for our 7 panelists, and we've got quite an architecture to get everybody on screen and sharing their thoughts on all the issues that are challenging to us and the MCBK movement at this time. So please do feel free for the other work groups to put questions in. If you have questions for the sustainability work group, Jerry and Terry can answer those as well as we move through our panel this morning. I'm not seeing any questions at this point, so let's go ahead and go to the Standards and Technical Infrastructure Working Group. We have 3 co-chairs for that working group, and I see you all there. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. The technology behind this is really quite amazing. I wish you could all see what I'm seeing here in this studio, but I'm glad to see you, Bob Greenis, Bruce Bray, and Jamie McCusker. So if you want to go ahead and speak a few words about your working group, and we will receive Q&As as they come in, and I'll read them to you at the end.
I guess I'll start. I'm Bruce Bray. I'm a cardiologist and clinical informaticist at the University of Utah, and enjoyed participating in the MCBK process over the years. Been kind of one of those nerdy people who enjoy sitting through HL7 standards meetings and as well as DICOM imaging standards meetings. takes a little bit of weirdness to do that. But the nice thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, and particularly in the data standards side of things. We're pretty far down the track as far as being able to share data from medical record systems and in the biology side of things. What isn't quite as mature is the standards for the knowledge sharing, knowledge mobilization side of things. So that's kind of one of the focuses of this group. We are a consolidated group. I tend to be a lumper instead of a splitter anyways, and it makes a lot of sense that the standards and the technical infrastructure side of it really belongs together. So this is the first time that we've kind of have the consolidated work group. So there's some interesting discussions to be had there. In HL7, there's 20 different work groups. I think 3 is plenty to start with for this, particularly if we can cross-pollinate across them. Mentioned, well, let's see, and then as was discussed in this morning's presentation, we're kind of interested in the whole life cycle of knowledge, from the T1 basic research through translation to the bedside, the clinic and the clinical side of things, as well as the education and research side of things, and not just clinical care. The accomplishments that so far basically been a couple of things, a couple of different papers. I can mention the first one, and then a little later Jamie can talk about the second one. So we did just recently publish a paper about the categories for metadata for sharing computable knowledge in the Learning Health System Journal, I think in April. So I didn't put a link there, but we'll get a link in the chat, and it'll be available in the near future. And then Jamie will mention the other paper. I guess, do you want to talk about that now, Jamie?
Yeah, sure. So the guiding principles for technical infrastructure to support computable analytic knowledge, title in progress. It's actually, so we're in the final stages of editing before submission. We're targeting NPJ digital medicine. And it's basically a position paper going over the specific principles that are needed for computable biomedical knowledge as for infrastructures that support it. One interesting thing about this paper, and then also the paper that's been published through what was the standards group, and also the work that has been happening in the sustainability and equity group, is that we've all been focusing quite a bit on FAIR, which was actually very reassuring. That we all kind of have that same basis for what we think is important when it comes to working with CBK. And so this paper is designed to be a little technical in terms of kind of the details about what you can support, but it's mostly about, here are the use cases, here are the things that we think that that infrastructures are going to need to support, and basically how that will go about happening. That's obviously for further, that's further work. And then finally, what we're looking at in terms of kind of the readability and accessibility is that when Tim Berners-Lee started Semantic Web and then Linked Data, those were in many ways launched by position papers that he wrote. They're very straightforward, very easy to read, and fairly clear. We've tried to use them as much as possible for inspiration in terms of the type of paper we were writing. It is more scholarly than his position papers were, but kind of in that same vein. Hopefully we'll get it in soon.
Okay, and then talking a little bit about the future, and the future is starting tomorrow with our breakout session, is that it's been interesting to see the advances in actual implementation of computable knowledge. Many of our academic centers have been doing this. I know Ken Kawamoto in our group here that runs our knowledge management and mobilization group has really been able to take knowledge and embed it in our medical record system in the form of dashboards, calculators, guideline suggestions, a lot of the things that we're talking about. Several of the examples will be presented in posters later this afternoon. And so we thought that the one things we'd focus on tomorrow would be to kind of talk about the collaborative opportunities across the spectrum of healthcare provider groups, the vendors, the standards organizations, a couple of the implementation groups like the logical graphite group and so forth. So there's a number of those. You'll see some of those in the posters and in the presentations. I think Jerry Osheroff and Brian Alper will talk a little bit about their projects that took some of the principles from the paper that we had and are trying to actually look at implementation of those sort of things. So that's the main purpose of the breakout group for us tomorrow afternoon. And I think there's more than this was just a starter list of those kind of things. There's a dozen or more things, and particularly the things that were already discussed this morning. We just hope to have an interesting discussion about where to focus on and where to collaborate across the spectrum to actually implement some of these ideas around the computability and the delivery of the knowledge to the point of use. But Bob, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, just to kind of highlight what you said, I don't see myself on the screen, but I guess that's okay. Hope people can hear me. So we talked about context aware, actually the keynote that we heard about context aware delivery, and that's one of the key opportunities, I think, of kind of getting knowledge resources at the point of use. And so I think that is beginning to become a very important aspect of what people are interested in. And hopefully we can get some ideas around where those opportunities exist and kind of drive some future work along those lines collaboratively.
And then the one thing that we'll see how much push there is for getting started on it. But one thing that we were thinking of doing as a future working group idea, and we want to gauge the interest of the community in participating in that, is building out some very simple, straightforward metadata semantics and basically like a vocabulary for publishing knowledge metadata. So W3C has something called the dataset catalog, which was actually extremely influential in the open government data work in making government data findable, accessible, and reusable. And so we feel like if there's an opportunity there for doing similar things with knowledge, not necessarily to make it automatically and transparently usable right off the bat, but at least have it be discoverable, understand what kind of knowledge you're working with and who to contact to find out more about it, and so on. So that's going to be, we'll be hopefully collecting some use cases around that to see kind of what the needs are from actually a lot of these other projects that they might find for both consuming and publishing knowledge metadata. But then also we're we're looking at kind of how can we reach out to other knowledge sources besides purely clinical knowledge. So there's actually quite a few very large knowledge resources in the biological, computational biology, and informatics space. And so to some degree, these things are very large and possibly overwhelming to have a large remodel into other knowledge systems, but we do need to bridge that gap because there is modeling that's already taking place on that side. So we're going to discuss how can we get those two worlds at least looking in the same direction.
So I wanted to add something also. We talked about spectrum of users. There's a spectrum of life cycle also that we want to think about. For example, the Brian Alpert and Jerry Osheroff demonstration about evidence to knowledge is really more at the knowledge generation and knowledge validation stage. But then there's knowledge management, knowledge, basically knowledge integration, and then there's actual knowledge use at the point of care. So there are kind of progression of kind of workflow cycles that are needed to be addressed. And there are different communities, I think, among us that are interested in some of these. So I think one of the things we want to try to identify is what are those communities that could actually step up and begin to take on some of these initiatives.
Yeah, so particularly what are the collaboration opportunities across our different work groups? Because you can see we can't really separate completely from the trust and the sustainability and the inclusion ideas if we want to do this well. So I think with that, then we're ready maybe to turn back to Rachel if there's any questions.
Terrific. Thank you all for your thoughts. It's really an exciting work group, and I'm excited about the merger, and it makes perfect sense. And all of you have alluded to the variety of disciplines and interests that really fall in this large umbrella of standards and technical infrastructure. So thank you for sharing that. We don't have any questions. If people do have any particular questions for this group, please put them in the chat or the question and answer. Otherwise, I did want to just make a couple of remarks before we move to the policy and coordination working group presentation. And that's that this all of MCBK, it clearly we're all about health, and there's clearly strong clinical implications, and Bob and Bruce obviously have medical and clinical backgrounds, but we've pulled in and through the working group and our various meetings, people that come from other domains and perspectives, including public health, education, and research. And I think Jamie brings in a terrific background with life sciences in research and in ontology. So the leadership of this group is just terrific. And we'll see who joins tomorrow. And I really want to encourage folks to join tomorrow afternoon in Eastern time, 1:15 to 3:45 Eastern times, where we have several hours to really talk and dig through these issues. And the way our meetings typically work is it really depends on who shows up in terms of what areas we focus on. But there's certainly opportunity in all these working groups to have sub-projects and subgroups. And I think we are getting to that point where we've certainly seen it in the sustainability and the policy working groups, where we've got, and standards for that matter, where we have multiple projects going on, as you've heard. So there are many opportunities for projects that can complement whatever background that you're coming from in MCBK, and standards and technical infrastructure is a huge bucket in a critically important area. That we look forward to folks participating in that, as well as our other working groups. Next, we will move toward in the third working group session. Oh, you're there. Okay, terrific. So we've got policy and coordination to ensure quality and trust, which again is a large umbrella of critically important topics topics, and there's some interaction and dynamics between all of the work groups on these very topics. So we look forward to hearing from you, Jody Platt and Blackford Middleton, about your work group and what they're up to. And then as we move into the next part of the panel, I will ask some questions of the different work groups and give you a chance to talk to each other and let the audience see how our different work groups collaborate and what synergy there is in terms of their perspective. So Jody and Blackford, thanks for joining, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the presentation so far and for being here. And we get to talk a little bit about what our work group has been doing. So I co-chair this group with Blackford Middleton, and he'll take up the second half of the presentation. I'm based here at the University of Michigan in the Department of Learning Health Sciences. And we're going to be presenting a little bit of the work that we've been doing in the Trust and Policy Working Group. We're sort of a nice little vibrant, intelligent, really talented little group of people that are thinking a lot about some big topics. So we sort of present some high level stuff today, and then tomorrow we'll get into some more details things. To sort of give it away, what we've been doing is sort of trying to get a survey out in the field to understand what is the landscape of knowledge, computable biomedical knowledge repositories in particular, and how are they organized, and how are they governed, and what do they do to make themselves trustworthy to the greater community that they're trying to serve. So I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview about the frameworks we've been sort of trying to understand and sort of study to help us frame our thinking in that investigation. And then we'll talk about what's going to happen in the breakout session tomorrow. So again, our focus this year has been in identifying the sort of key principles and best practices among digital knowledge repositories. How do they promote trust? What are their best practices? How do they think about what they're doing? And again, sort of, we spent a good amount of, even last year, and then for a good amount of time this year, trying to understand among ourselves, what is a repository? What does it mean to collect knowledge? Is that public knowledge? Is it private knowledge? Is it somewhere in between? And so I'm going to go over a few of the key frameworks that we've been thinking about and sort of, again, organizing our own thinking. We're going to start a little bit abstract, and then try maybe get to sort of really sort of fundamental principles and sort of key driving things that you can begin to develop policy around. It looks like we've got about 4 to talk about today. So the first one we started to look at comes from Strandberg et al. And this is sort of, based on ideas around, it's just sort of the tragedy of the commons. You may have heard of that. And then understanding sort of how people might apply evaluative criteria to sort of where action is happening, sort of how knowledge is organized, and how repositories are governed, and then what are the characteristics of the knowledge itself. And so this is one way that we could sort of begin to think about it. And again, this is one of the sort of more foundational principles. We've also drawn a little bit on library science, so looking at the track criteria and checklist for trustworthy repositories audit and certification that comes from library science. And again, so they begin to lay out what is a trustworthy repository and what do you need to have in terms of the governance of that organization so that people will use what you put in there. And then the last 2 that we looked at, one was from some work that we did that was headed up by Blackford and Josh Richardson and myself, and the Learning Network and the CDS Connect enterprise. They, about maybe it was 2 years ago now, set out to look at who is involved in this ecosystem of CBK. So who are the so that includes developers, it includes implementers, it includes programmers, it includes patients at the center of it all. It includes providers, it includes, you can imagine, I think we identified about 12 different sort of personality types and personas in that ecosystem, and then began to decide what does it take for these individuals and these characters to trust one another. And we had this fabulous matrix of 12 by 12, and from there we gleaned 9 trust attributes of a knowledge repository. And we began to articulate those, and that's informed our work in the last year. And then also late in 2020, I think it was in the fall, there was a paper that was published that again laid out trust principles for digital repositories. And in this context, they were thinking more about the digital data repositories than digital knowledge repositories. But it's an interesting question: what translates from the data space to the knowledge space? And it was helpful that they outlined it in terms of TRUST. So in this acronym, trust is transparency about sort of specific services and data holdings, responsibility for authenticating and assuring the integrity of what's in the repository itself. To what extent are you prioritizing the user in those efforts? Is your repository sustainable over the long term to what you're holding in there? And then finally, what's the technology that's involved? And so you see, like, there's clear sort of connections between our group and the other two here. So this was sort of where we started in terms of how we wanted to frame our research questions and our investigation into the landscape of digital knowledge repositories. So Blackford's going to tell us more about that.
Thank you, Jody. So the research is really transcendent across the sustainability and inclusion and standards and interoperability in many ways, because not only do we have to understand what are the unique attributes that make a individual knowledge asset trustworthy, potentially in a composite knowledge artifact sense that it's used in, but also how do different individuals with very different backgrounds and purposes and intents trust that same knowledge artifact. And thus it really is sort of a very interesting problem. So we set out to understand basically the current practices of how knowledge repositories are formed, how are they operating, what principles guide their management and development and use, if you will, and took it upon ourselves to survey a set of knowledge repositories that were opportunistically defined, if you will, and ask them a long set of questions. Everyone gets a prize if they finish our survey, but we were lucky to have a pretty good response rate, which the next slide will detail. We surveyed 48 organizations across the country. This was all U.S., not international. And we're in the process now of analyzing the data. And we ask questions about how they're managing governance, for example. What gets in a repository? What is removed? What are the life cycle methods that are applied to the knowledge management, as Bob Greenis just was talking about? And what are their metadata practices? This would be very interesting as we get these results to compare to the standards group metadata work Jamie was just describing. And how might these findings be sliced and diced, if you will, not only across the FAIR framework, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but also across the L1, 2, 3, 4 framework that defines how we progressively abstract, translate, and specify knowledge artifacts for computable use. Next. So tomorrow, we're going to have a bunch of fun and encourage everybody to stop by if you can. We'll review the findings we have to date. We're going to try to interpret what they mean and have small group breakouts looking at each of TRUST data if we have enough people, and hopefully arrive at two things. One is some interpretation, if you will, of the findings to date. What do these findings mean so far? And what research agenda might they define? What questions might they illuminate, if you will, about further work to not only define attributes for maintaining and sustaining trust, but perhaps even to develop metrics that might measure whether a repository is up to snuff, if you will, on its knowledge management practices and repository best principles of practice, et cetera. We'll use a tool that looks pretty cool to me. I've never used it before, but from the subgroups, we'll gather the insights and observations that each come up with and put them in a neat little tool, tricider.com, to try to vote and rank based upon our breakout, what are the most important issues of the day. and what might be questions to address in the future. So that's a quick pitch. Anything I left out, Jody?
I think you did a great job. But I know what we're doing. We'll leave it.
Rachel, back to you.
Terrific. Thank you. I think that was a great summary from both of you. I encourage folks to enter questions into the Q&A for Jody and Blackford and for all the work groups. In fact, we don't have any at this point, so I think you made a crystal clear presentation of all the great work that you're doing. You didn't say what the prize was for the survey, though, Blackford.
Yeah, you have to do it first, Rachel.
Okay. I'll make note of that. So again, I encourage folks to put questions in the chat, and I want to remind you also and encourage you to attend the breakout sessions, the action sessions tomorrow at 1:15 Eastern time for any of these work groups to really jump in and contribute. And you can see there's so much going on with each of them. At this point in the program, I've prepared some questions for the different work group co-chairs, and I hope they won't be too surprised by these questions. But I wanted to ask the same question of a couple different groups to really highlight what Bruce had said earlier about the fact that so many of these issues cross groups, and really to address the mission of MCBK and our vision, we really need all these three components of infrastructure and standards, sustainability, and policy and trust. So let me go ahead and start with my first question. I'm going to direct that to Bob, and then we'll move from there. So the first question is, what's your ideal future of CBK and this ecosystem, and how does your work group fit into that CBK ecosystem?
Well, I guess my vision is this idea of context-based knowledge and the ability to invoke knowledge at the point of care or the point of action where needed.
Terrific, thanks. And Jamie, did you also have a comment or reflection on that question?
So my vision, so it's actually kind of broad, and it may be incredibly unrealistic, but there are, so if you remember in the Star Trek Next Generation, Beverly Crusher was basically dealing with like a disease a week. It's usually something new she'd never seen before, but basically, she was able to figure it out and kind of do kind of like the end-to-end science in order to solve that problem that would kind of get them through whatever problem they were having. I feel like obviously that's a very long way away to being able to do exactly that. First off, we don't have space worms or space parasites yet, but kind of being able to say, hey, let's actually like dig into this problem and have kind of a unified way of actually working across all these knowledge resources to figure out what needs to be learned in order to solve a medical problem, both from the science and the medical side together.
Terrific. Thanks for sharing that. And Jody, do you have thoughts on the CBK ecosystem of your dreams and how your work group fits into that?
Sure, I can give it a shot. I think the dream is that, so CBK is, there's a lot of it. It's coming from a lot of different sources. There's a lot of different fields that it's trying to contribute to. And we have an opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's an opportunity for all of that information and knowledge in this computable form to contribute to the noise, or it can contribute to the solutions. And my hope is that this group steers us towards the solution sets, right? And one of the ways we can do that is ensuring that those products are trustworthy, and that the organizations that create them, that implement them, that put them to work are trustworthy, and that they're improving the world that we live in now, and not just leaving it the way it is.
Terrific. Thank you. And before I ask Terry the same question, we do have a question on if Bob could elaborate on that context-based knowledge. Maybe I cut you off on that, but the idea of context-based knowledge, could you share a few words on that?
Well, I'm coming from the clinical context, but you could apply this to elsewhere. a provider is in a particular context, site, practice setting, specialization, and has a patient with a particular set of problems and status of those problems. And as the clinical encounter is worked through at various points, there are questions or actions or intentions that kind of arise that you can anticipate. And if you are able to tag the appropriate knowledge resources to provide the order sets, the suggestions, the guideline steps, other things that are pertinent to those at the point of need, that's a very desirable future, I think.
Great, thank you. And I could see how metadata in your work group will then fit right into that vision. Terry, can you share a few words from your perspective about the ultimate, or your vision of a CBK ecosystem and how the activities of your work group might fit into that?
Sure, Rachel. The future CBK ecosystem, in our view, would be open and available to everyone. It would be transparent, allowing for findability, accessibility, provided that its owners or stewards are willing for it to be accessible. It would have interoperability and reproducibility. It would be free, no cost to anyone to access it. It would also be fair in terms of justice and equity. What may be challenging about this vision is that for-profit companies may not want to share proprietary information openly with no remuneration. What also may be challenging about this may be that for-profit companies may want to place access controls around something that is meant to be open and public good. There are challenges that we will need to navigate to achieve this vision of an open, fair, and just CBK ecosystem. We will also need to mitigate the technical divide that prohibits some people from accessing CBK, while others have the technology and privileges to access it without even thinking about those who inherently cannot access CBK. So that's some thoughts about where we see the future of CBK ecosystem moving.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And that certainly highlights all the dimensions of these challenges in terms of social, political, economic, and collaborative and communication challenges. So thanks for sharing that. Let me move on. And again, I want to encourage folks to share their questions in the Q&A. Let me pose another question to a few of the groups. How does your work group and activities affect or potentially impact the safety of algorithms and computable biomedical knowledge? Bruce?
So, of course, we're talking about, with safety, we're talking about trust somewhat, and that's one of the metadata contexts. The categories in the paper that we had just mentioned, there's several categories there that might be relevant for the safety side of things. First is the provenance. When we are looking for patient education materials on the internet, we care about who it comes from, how well it's been validated. Is it just one person's opinion, or is it a whole institution's well-studied opinion? So the provenance is one of those categories of metadata that can be described about any particular knowledge. The second would be the evidence base, which is kind of what is the data that was used to train that AI algorithm, and of course the bias implicit in if that patient cohort was as diverse as it should be in order to come up with a fair approach. And then the third would be the metadata idea of usage evidence. How well has this been used? Has it been revised recently? Has it been well studied? Does it get a 5-star rating or a 1-star rating from the actual users? All three of those can sort of be helpful in this space.
Terrific. Thanks for sharing. And Blackford, do you have any thoughts on the safety of algorithms and the impact of MCBK?
I do. And just to add a coda to the answers provided to the first question, my own vision of what this knowledge ecosystem looks like is kind of like a to use an analogy, the automobile supply chain. If a wing nut is made in Ohio, there's some certainty and guarantee that it works on the hubcap of the car being built in Detroit or up in Michigan. We don't have that level of assurance or trustworthiness or competency, if you will, in how all these knowledge components come together. So looking at the trust and policy work group, I think Bruce already has highlighted several of the attributes which relate directly to the quality of a knowledge artifact, its credibility, its evidence base, and its life cycle management, if you will. But the other key factor is something Bruce hinted at I'd just like to underscore. I think knowledge authors now who do draw parts from a vast set of toolboxes need to be able to build their knowledge artifacts and test them not only on publicly available standard test data sets, but on their own data. If I knew for a fact that my patient population was somehow different than the patient population on which an algorithm was created, I would know, therefore, that I would have to fine-tune that algorithm somehow. And that actually should be part of the authoring process so that local priors and local variety, if you will, can inform algorithms and improve their utility.
Terrific. Thank you. And Jerry, could you share a little bit about your perspective and your work group's perspective on the safety of algorithms in CBK?
Sure. So just for a little bit of context, the Sustainability and Inclusion Work Group, we've always had as a kind of a core goal promoting the value proposition of MCBK. And we see that as sort of necessary work if we're going to sustain the CBK, but also ensure that we've included equity issues and inclusion, and they're considered from the very get-go of the work that we're doing. Especially as we build these applications. So we've seen our group largely as responsible for that mobilizing piece of the MCBK initialism. And it's for these reasons that we've organized a lot of our work around advocacy, as I stressed earlier. You know, whether that's advocacy through partnerships with other like-minded entities and groups, or it's advocacy through scholarship and the information that we put out through the literature, whether it's advocacy through education. As I mentioned in our future goals, this is an area of great interest for us. Or whether it's around the emerging areas of interest through research. So we believe that through advocacy in all these areas, our work group is really positioned to call attention to things like issues around safety, around bias, gaps, reproducibility, lack of transparency, really any of the sorts of issues or concerns that you might have with algorithmic approaches to delivery of healthcare or healthcare services. And then by extension, of course, to machine learning and AI approaches. So just as we have advocacy, around things like sunshine laws and open meeting regulations and that sort of thing. So we also want to bring that sunshine and transparency and disclosure and openness to algorithms as a strategy to ensure safety. So our work, as I mentioned, is values-based, and so we think that this is a really critical point of reference for all of us. Rachel, does that address the question?
Terrific. Very comprehensive. And actually, I'd like to pass to Terry and see if she has something to add, particularly in terms of health disparities and health equity and how CBK and MCBK and your work group in particular can move us towards that vision.
Sure, Rachel. I concur with what Jerry said. We partnered together on thinking through this, and I do think that, as Jerry mentioned, there are great opportunities for us to look at how we can ensure that health equity is addressed and that bias is reduced or eliminated. And we primarily will call attention to it, like through our thought piece, we're going to call attention to this. It's well known that algorithms, machine learning, and these applications can readily perpetuate bias and thus reinforce things like structural racism. The role of the algorithm is to recreate which currently exists by using mathematical models to achieve that recreation. However, traditionally, fewer minorities receive state-of-the-art interventions for various health conditions than an algorithm would mathematically seek to mimic that bias. There are so many additional ways that the bias can be introduced into algorithms as well. And these include biases in model design, biases in the training data, biases in the interactions with clinicians, and biases in interactions with patients. Biased and racist information is by nature unsafe, especially for minorities and marginalized communities. Our work group supports detecting and mitigating bias by calling attention to it, as we hope to direct in our current thought piece that we're drafting for publication. As a movement, inclusion has been a core value of MCBK. It's found in our work group name, and as such, our focus of our efforts is in advocating for health equity. Our work group is currently developing a web-based guide for information about health equity resources that I mentioned previously. We're hoping to complete that and host it by our library members, as I mentioned. And our contributions largely in this area are conscious raising and education by nature.
Terrific. Thanks, Terry. And this is great. I'm seeing a lot of questions come in through the question and A tab, so many of which we're starting to answer here. I think Bruce had already addressed a lot of the aspects about the bias in his remarks. Did you have anything to add, or we could go to Jody? Just any comments on the discussion so far?
No, I think we have common thoughts about this across the different work groups. I don't have anything to add to what's already been said.
Yeah, terrific. I'm seeing synergy across comments, and so this is terrific. And this really is what we wanted to do. A lot of these issues clearly cut across all of our work groups. So your comments earlier prefaced that for us, and we're seeing it in action here. Jody, do you have any thoughts on how to detect or mitigate bias, or what ways that we could work together to use CBK to improve health equity?
Yeah, I mean, again, just to underscore what's been said already, and maybe just again, underscore two comments in particular. One is, Blackford talked a little bit about, the idea that there's a verification process when you put the CBK models and stuff into the world that doesn't exist in any, there may be some one-off examples of that, but really figuring out who's responsible for the health equity implications of the use of the models. Is it the health system? Is it all of us? Is it a specific patient population? That's something that's not currently clear at all. And in order to both mitigate the bias, address the bias, and create the trustworthy system we want, we need that kind of guidance for our community and communities. And then the other thing I want to underscore at this point is something that Jerry said at the beginning, I think of one of his comments sort of highlighting, we talk about the FAIR principles of findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, but there's also FAIR as just a regular word as a core principle, and then the CARE principles that he talked about also. So sort of and I'm going to maybe jump to one of your later questions, including those communities who are going to be discriminated against as a result of the bias, making sure that those concerns are part of the governance of CBK in the future and now, actually starting right now, not in the future, now, the future too.
Great. Terrific. Thanks, Jody. And the next question, I've seen a few questions in the chat around the theme of the role of libraries. And so I'd like to explore that a little, the role of the library in the future CBK ecosystem. I'll ask Jerry, Terry, our librarians, and then Blackford to comment on that. So Jerry, what are your thoughts on the role of the library? And perhaps you could squeeze in another question, the publication of CBK, how that fits into your agenda as well.
Sure. Thank you. Well, of course, I'm Associate Dean in the library. I'm going to be advocating for libraries in all of this work, and I have been. But, I think library and information science for library, list professionals, as we might call them, are really critical, especially for that aspect of findability and accessibility, although I think it's the other parts of FAIR as well. And we think that these principles are really core to what MCBK wishes to advance. And, referencing FAIR and thinking about libraries, we are a values-based organization, so it should be no surprise that we would emphasize these things. Librarians and libraries collect and make findable and accessible information resources. CBK is just another information resource. And we have deep expertise in our organizations around things like metadata schema, around deploying and supporting various digital repositories. We heard Jordan talk about the work that's happening around inventorying what repositories are out there. So to hear the work that they're doing, bringing in lists or library information science tools into that assessment is terrific. Libraries provide and support, instruction and data science, competency and computational skills building. We do this out of our libraries all the time. We're promoting standards interoperability. I think of the great work that NLM has done in this regard. Of course, information systems architecture are things that we're interested in, as well as the broader infrastructures, and providing really support for the whole scholarly communications piece. Which addresses, I think, the publication component, right? So as Jordan was talking about with repositories for CBK, libraries are also looking at this, the nature of the repositories that we have. Are they going to be able to accommodate knowledge? Are they going to be able to really function with this type of an artifact? So when I think about the roles that we play working with student and faculty and trainee and administrators and all of these folks, we really are connectors and networkers. And these skills, I think, really enable us to support that information scientists' work and coming forward to support all of this. I see our work happening, of course, in the academy where I happen to be, but it also is happening in the for-profit sector and nonprofit for good communities. Libraries and librarians and people with LIST degrees are active in these spaces as well. As well as in government work, right? So I really see LIST professionals as being key stakeholders. And I could go on, but I'll stop there. But to circle back real quickly to the publication piece, we've been doing quite a bit of talk within our group about the publishing process and where does publishing about CBK occur, whether it's in our professional scholarly journals, open access, reprint repositories, other kinds of places, and how can we enable and really lift that access?
Yeah. Great, thank you. I see we've got Blackford up, and we also wanted to get to Terry as well. I know both of you have thought about the role of libraries, so we'll see who shows up on screen. Oh, Terry. Great. Terry, do you have any thoughts to add on the role of libraries in the future?
Sure. Jerry spoke primarily on the technical aspects of what libraries can bring, so I'll talk a little bit more on the philosophical aspects. Libraries champion open science and open ecosystems. The role of the library could be critical in championing an open CBK ecosystem. Libraries are also viewed as a neutral inside organizations. They serve all equally and all fairly. They are sometimes referred to as Switzerland in local turf wars, not taking sides, but championing the greater good. Libraries will continue to play this role, bringing various stakeholders and various groups to the table to work collaboratively, because librarians usually are aware of similar work done in pockets across the university enterprise. They often bring partners together and can continue to help forge partnerships and collaborations that will benefit the larger CBK ecosystem.
Terrific. Thanks so much for those thoughts, Terry. This is really great foundational background for us to have. Blackford, do you have any thoughts? I know you do on libraries and CBK.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rachel. And I do think this conversation is spot on. And I'll add one twist, however. We do need to have both publicly available, openly accessible, and inspectable knowledge assets in public repositories, if you will, like libraries, supported by the government as a public good. We also need to have open marketplaces that add value to knowledge assets and make them into computable artifacts. And in the U.S., that is driven by the profit motive for sure. It doesn't mean that the knowledge isn't open or a platform isn't open and the knowledge should be inspectable and explainable, as has been discussed. But if we're improving the way care is delivered and reducing cost, improving quality, or enhancing patient experience or provider experience, that is added value. And we know from the literature, many of the folks on this call, that these kinds of CDS artifacts can improve quality, reduce cost, and other improve patient and provider experience. So I've written a proposal with several others from the Patient-Centered CDS Learning Network that I didn't think of sharing until this moment with the Sustainability Work Group, if you don't already have it. But we described how these public and private knowledge repositories need to fit together, and the AHRQ seems to have taken it very, very seriously and literally.
Yeah. Terrific. Thanks for sharing that. We're getting some good questions, and what's going through my mind now, for those that can't see the technologies, I have to pick and choose who's answering these questions, but I do want to give, we've got 7 terrific co-chairs on 3 strong working groups. So if you have things to add, I think you could probably wave your hands, and Mike and his technical team can get you on screen, and I can call on you to share your remarks. But let me go ahead and start with Brendan's question, which has a Star Trek flair. So I'm going to direct that to Jamie, but I'm sure some of our clinical folks or others might have a thought on this before we move on to some questions about some of the specific roles of the work groups that have come up. So Jamie, do you think COVID-19, long COVID, is one of the Star Trek challenges or the Star Trek challenge for MCBK, or could you comment on some others perhaps?
I think it's been, actually, to a large degree. I mean, when I originally conceived that idea of, let's science this like they do on TV, I was thinking in terms of things like, rare diseases or cancer or other things that require personalized medicine. But to a large degree, this has been has been applied quite a bit in the process of kind of understanding how COVID works and kind of disseminating that knowledge. Through this pandemic, we've actually radically restructured and accelerated the process of knowledge dissemination, including, adding things like putting out, having ways of restructuring it into machine-readable formats. Now, one problem with that, though, is that it's error-prone, and there's really not that kind of room for error in actual treatment. In terms of long COVID specifically, I think it is actually going to be, to a large degree, it's basically the very essence of personalized medicine, because each case is so unique. You have, really strange symptoms that you haven't seen in many other people. They're manifesting in different ways based on how everything kind of coalesces together in that person. I think that in order to manage or cure those diseases, we are going to need something where people are going to need to be able to act on knowledge that's outside of their specialty, and act on knowledge that they can get to through research rather than through their conventional training, because it's not going to prepare. There's no conventional training for figuring out why a respiratory disease is causing, cause massive lung damage, why it has long-term immunology effects. It either requires these huge teams or a better integration of the knowledge itself.
Terrific, thank you. Do any other panelists care to comment on that question? And if not, I will move on to quickly address Tony Salamides asked a question for me, but I would again pose to our work group. I'll comment and I'll see if any of our co-chairs have anything to add. I presume by sort of waving your hands, and then we will get you on screen. Tony asks, how do we bring the visions, ideas of these three groups together? And I'll say that really is one of the functions of this meeting, is to, in this particular panel, to really offer the work groups to talk to each other and let our audience in our community hear the different perspectives and really see that the overlap of issues, there is a tremendous overlap of the issues to achieve this MCBK vision. We absolutely need all these work groups. I think what you're getting at, Tony, is I remember you asked me this question 2 years ago when we actually had the chance to meet face-to-face at Lister Hill, which was terrific, because I think, the real way we're going to address this is by getting together more and talking more and understanding what people are doing and talking through issues and deciding which problems and projects would cross multiple work groups. We try within our internal coordinating center to have some level of communication across work groups, and the chairs meet periodically, and we have great support staff that sort of cross-populates the working groups. But I'll look forward to your ideas, Tony, of how we can really build these synergies and keep coordination, because the risk here is that we're going to duplicate work, and really the mission's too great, the work is too great for us to have any inefficiency in what we do. Jamie, did you have something else to add in terms of that coordination aspect?
Yeah, so one very immediately operational thing that we can do is that the trust group, their survey is going to be, I think that's going to be essential for our metadata standard, our metadata vocabulary. They've got all these different implementers out there that they're collating information from. We would like to know what they need from, especially from kind of, if they're publishing knowledge in an open way, what do they want to be able to put out there? Is there a standard? Is there a baseline? The other thing is that one thing that you probably noticed from Deborah McGinnis's talk is kind of the cross-cutting nature of a lot of our projects at RPI, and that we're doing things with fairness of specifically like study cohorts and dissemination of large-scale knowledge graphs. And so I really see, I really kind of want to, we'll certainly connect our students, but I think that MCBK can be a way to connect a lot of the students that are working on this sort of research with the CBK community through MCBK. And I think that there are like specific people that I want to send over to the trust group now because of the because of what they're doing. Same with sustainability. I want to get them in front of those guys, and I think that's hopefully going to be true with a lot of the people here. But I think that the more cross-pollination we can have, the better off we are.
Yeah. Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. And we'll see. I hope this starts to happen, that we have folks that attend both of the working groups and can share what's happening in those to keep the communication going. I'd love to get to Jia Jing's question, and I would like to ask it to Blackford and then Jerry and then Bruce or Bob, if you've got a comment from your perspective. So Jia's question is, curious about the goals of the working groups. Are we trying to provide guidelines for the field, or products or services for the field, or a platform or venue for people to work together on selected topics? And before we move it to you, Blackford, I'll say that really will come up, I think, in the future of MCBK session tomorrow morning. What are we? What are we going to be? How do we move forward? But I'm curious if you, Blackford, Jerry, or Bob have thoughts on that question.
Certainly. Thank you, Rachel. Terrific question, apropos. I think there's the trust and policy, the standards, individual work group efforts, which are all relevant, but I'd love to see them woven together in a way that helps us create and deliver upon the MCBK vision of shareable, portable, computable knowledge at scale. I think MCBK has an opportunity perhaps to become a reference standards type body for knowledge artifacts and use. W3C and other models come to mind to that end. However, I don't see MCBK creating technologies or selling technologies. I think it establishes best practices, standards, and methods in a collaborative, pre-competitive way, if you will, that makes sense for all of us to participate in.
Great, thanks. Jerry, do you have any comments?
I do. Yeah, sorry. As I mentioned, a key goal for the Sustainability and Inclusion Group has always been around promoting that knowledge or the value proposition of CBK. One of the things that I experienced in my lived experience of doing this work and working with this fabulous team over the last few years is, depending on the community, I always have to do a fair amount of explanation of just what is it that I mean. So I think one of the things that we're really interested in, as I think I indicated with what we're going to do in our breakouts and whatnot, is develop assets that are repurposable and reusable to explain what it is in terms of the nature of this work. Deborah McGinnis talked about that accessibility component with constituencies and communities and usability and the knowledge about. That so resonated with me because I think that's really much of the work that we want to do and why we've pivoted a little bit more to focus on the education piece.
Great, thanks. And I think we had Bob up to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's lower my hand here.
There you are.
So one of the things we'll talk about in this plenary that you're mentioning about goals of MCBK is something that's had a lot of discussion, and that is, are we conveners, developers, just basically what the question is asking. And when we take something like metadata in particular, no one seems to own that space. There's lots of metadata development in HL7 and OMG and various organizations that are promoting various kinds of knowledge resources. And what we don't have is a consistent framework for that and a way to kind of organize, let's say, a search of metadata that would be relevant to a particular need. So I think what MCBK can play is that convening role and kind of orchestrating and helping to bring together the various approaches to any domain that we might be focusing on. And I think the domains we focus on are also driven by our membership and our stakeholders. So I think it's a fluid kind of role, but it's a role that no one is filling right now.
Great, thank you. I see one more question. I think we've gotten to some of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A through our discussion already. I have a clarifying question for the trust group that I think I see Blackford. I'd like to ask you a quick question, and then we'll close out with our last question about what stakeholders you wish were engaged in MCBK or your work group. And for that, I'll go to Bruce, then Jamie, Jerry, and Jody to finish us off there. So Blackford, do you think you have a big enough sample, is the question, in terms of your survey, and what were your thoughts on that sampling?
Well, interestingly, it was an opportunistic population identification exercise. We came up with whatever it was, the 48, and even those are extremely variable across the sample by type. So, difficult question, because one might ask equally validly, do we do subgroup analysis of libraries or the Value Set Authority Center or terminology providers or what have you? In a way, our first pass is kind of applying a relatively blunt instrument to those who were willing to respond. And tomorrow, so here's the hook, tomorrow we're going to reveal, what kind of organizations responded and what they had to say. But really our goal in the long term, I think, is to develop, best principles or practices that would be made available, publicly made available to all of these sorts of knowledge repositories or emerging digital libraries and the like, so that everyone's on the same page with a set of best practices.
Terrific. Thank you. And we'll look forward to that tomorrow, and I'll encourage folks to attend. So let's close out. We just have a couple minutes left on this session before we go to our lightning poster presentation. So my final question for each of the work groups, and I'll start with Bruce, is what stakeholders do you wish were engaged in MCBK or your work group in particular that are imperative to move this forward?
Well, there's of course could be a fairly long list there, but getting back to the COVID issue, one of the things that COVID has been is a really good accelerator for these processes. Things that we used to think that were years long processes started being weekly and then daily changes to our actual implementation and practices in our hospital, for instance. So it's sometimes hourly, but then it's mostly been daily and now weekly. So that's a little bit more sustainable. But the point is that we actually take these things and take the knowledge and test the delivery for it. So the implementation side of this to me is most important. And that means getting healthcare provider organizations together with professional societies that generate the 1 or 2 year process for a practice guideline to the vendors who are developing this stuff and really that implementing in a logical or even a agile way, and then you learn from the implementation. So it's really, to me, it's about multiple groups implementing and learning from the implementation science side of that. And so that's basically everybody that we've talked about.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Bruce. And we'll go to Jamie in a minute or less. What stakeholders would you like to see here or us engage in the future? And then we'll go to Jerry and Jody.
So I feel kind of lonely as a computer scientist. I feel a little lonely as an ontologist, and I feel a little lonely as a computational biologist. I think that we need people on the from machine learning, semantics, and computational biology, basically the knowledge producers and extractors of the world to participate in these groups so that we can actually, get down. We're starting to get down to the nitty gritty of what do we need in order to make this stuff successful. And, I love the HL7 guys, but they're not. We need the other side of the coin there.
Terrific. Well, we're so glad you're with us here. Jerry, in a minute or less, what stakeholders do you wish were here?
Deborah McGinnis mentioned health information literacy, and that was just such a wonderful thing to hear. Where I'm going with this is that our patients and our organizations that represent patients, I think that they're really critical to be engaging with. That was one of the takeaways I thought from last year's annual meeting that really resonated with me. And I want to make a shout out to the work that the National Library of Medicine has done with its network of the National Library of Medicine with a focus on health information literacy. They have initiatives around citizen science, of course, the All of Us campaign and support for all of that. I think that where do people go when they have questions? They go to libraries, they go to other trusted sources for that kind of information, including public libraries. So I think that we need to engage that constituency too.
Terrific. Thanks so much. And Jody, final thoughts to close us out on what stakeholders do you wish you were here?
I think, so yes, to everything that's been said so far. And maybe to go back to if we're going to address the health equity questions and the bias sort of issues, doing not only just the patient engagement, but the real community engagement as well. Patty Brennan's talked about the care between the spaces is just as important as the care you get in the spaces. So to make sure that whatever we have incorporates that entire, the world we live in.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Well, this has been a terrific panel, and we just so appreciate the work that you are all doing to lead these 3 important work groups, and to thank all the people that are participating in these work groups whose ideas and products we've seen here today. So I encourage everyone to attend the work group action sessions tomorrow at 1:15 Eastern time, and just jump in and join and let's see what happens. There's lots to be done and so many important perspectives to include. So thank you all for sharing your time and thoughts with us today.